Good morning.
Good morning, Ms. O'Day.
Our first capstone presentation today is by Cameron Gary, and his thesis statement is faith-based films that depict Christianity in a diegetic manner or evangelistically ineffective because they alienate non-Christian audiences, whereas those that depict the Christianity in a mimetic manner are more evangelistically effective. Let's welcome Cameron, please.
Have you ever watched a Christian film that you thought was low quality? Conversely, have you ever watched a Christian film that you thought was high quality? Whatever films just came to mind, I ask that you keep them there. Film is the art form of our time. So says Catholic filmmaker and professor Barbara Nicolosi, who also says, quote, "Film combines the four classical art forms: literature, performance, music, and composition." End quote. Film is thus capable of reaching the heights of any of these forms. When it effectively combines them all, it can transcend those heights. Film is also one of the foremost evangelistic tools of our time. Bishop Robert Barron defines evangelization as a confident, Christocentric presentation of Christianity, attentive to the questions being asked at the time, and deeply conversant with all the ways in which those questions are being asked and answered. Indeed, we have seen film used in an evangelistic capacity. In 1979, the film Jesus was released. It was originally filmed in English, but has since been dubbed into over 2,000 languages as part of a larger missionary effort to spread the gospel to those who would otherwise have never encountered it. It is this evangelistic potential of film that motivates the production of faith-based films. A faith-based film is one whose substance is based on the premise of Christian faith and depicts Christian symbols, themes, or narratives explicitly. These films are either diegetic or mimetic in this depiction. According to the Living Handbook of Narratology, diegesis meaning narrative or narration, and mimesis meaning imitation, representation, or enactment, are two Greek terms first brought together to help categorize different ways of presenting a story. To put it simply, diegesis is to tell as mimesis is to show. A diegetic depiction of Christianity is a presentation of Christian truths to the audience through sermonic dialogue, while compelling the audience to assent to such precepts without contemplation. A mimetic depiction of Christianity is a presentation of Christian truths to the audience through the characters' actions, while leaving the audience to contemplate the film and come to their own conclusions. Two questions naturally arise. Which of these is more evangelistically effective, and why? Faith-based films that depict Christianity in a diegetic manner are evangelistically ineffective because they alienate non-Christian audiences, whereas those that depict Christianity in a mimetic manner are more evangelistically effective. Faith-based films can be divided into three subgenres. First, the Christian industry film, characterized by themes, narratives, and characters that attempt to, quote, represent Christians, their life experiences, their way of life, and their values from the perspective of Christians themselves, rather than Hollywood, end quote. Next, we have the Hollywood Christian film, characterized by maximized spectacle and larger-than-life narratives and characters, often from or inspired by scripture or real life. And finally, we have the Christian art house film, characterized by high-quality filmmaking and complex, conflicted characters who are ultimately forced to make a difficult decision regarding their faith. An examination of specific films will be made to determine the more effective depiction. The selected films are God's Not Dead, The Prince of Egypt, and A Hidden Life. Each of these case studies will include a synopsis, a twofold analysis, and a verdict on each film. The twofold analysis will be based on Nicolossi's claim regarding the four classical art forms and Bishop Barron's definition of evangelization, namely, the traits of being attentive to the questions and conversant in the manner of asking and answering. First up, God's not dead. College philosophy professor Mr. Radisson's curriculum is challenged by his new student, Josh, who believes that God exists. In the realm of literature, this film is unsuccessful. An ambitious narrative structure is based on an unrealistic premise, features stereotypical characters, and sermonic dialogue that lacks subtext. Next, in the realm of performance, the film is also unsuccessful, as the acting on the whole is subpar, consisting of stilted line delivery and contrived emotion. In the realm of music, this film is again unsuccessful, as the score does little to enhance the visuals in an interesting way. Finally, in the realm of composition, the film is partially successful. In the exception of a few images, the film lacks any sense of beauty in its imagery. This film is attentive to the questions in that it takes direct inspiration from hundreds of legal cases in which Christian university students were oppressed in either the practice or proclamation of their faith, and thus addresses real persecution and the importance of developing apologetic skills in Christian formation. For as St. Peter writes in his first letter, always be ready to give an explanation to anyone who asks for a reason for your hope. However, this film is not conversant in the manner of asking and answering, as this persecution, however real, is greatly exaggerated. An interfaith dialogue which ought to be built on relationship is reduced to verbal sparring. The verdict is that this film, despite the filmmaker's ambition and zeal, is evangelistically ineffective due to an over-reliance on a diegetic depiction of Christianity, which undermines the cinematic medium, which is visual by nature, and alienates non-believers by oversimplifying the faith. To put it colloquially, this film preaches to the choir rather than going out into the highways and the hedgerows as Christ commands. Next, the Prince of Egypt. Egyptian Prince Moses learns of his identity as a Hebrew and his destiny to become the chosen deliverer of his people. In the realm of literature, this film is successful, as the emphasis on the fraternal dynamic between Moses and Ramesses recontextualizes the Exodus narrative, and the decision to adapt the narrative as a musical provides a refreshing twist on a well-known story. In the realm of performance, the film is partially successful, hindered only by its limited use of the cast talents, that is, only their voices, as it is an animated film. In the realm of music, this film is successful. Hans Zimmer's equally contemplative and epic score is skillfully paired with Stephen Schwartz's poignant lyrics. Finally, in the realm of composition, this film is successful. It stunningly presents magnificent monuments and vast landscapes. Exemplary scenes include Moses' discovery of the burning bush, top right, and the parting of the Red Sea, bottom left. This film is attentive to the questions as it addresses the dilemma between faith and family, one addressed by Christ himself in Luke's Gospel. A father will be divided against his son, and a son against his father, a mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother, a mother-in-law against her daughter-in-law, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. This film is also conversant in the manner of asking and answering, as it depicts the tension between Moses and Ramesses escalating during the 10 plagues until Ramesses' firstborn son, Moses' foster nephew, is slain by the final plague. Rather than admonish Ramesses for his hardness of heart, Moses empathizes with his loss, while remaining committed to his God-given mission. The verdict is that this film is evangelistically effective because it takes full advantage of the power of cinema to convey a significant moment in salvation history. This mimetic approach to adapting Scripture renders not only the film, but the narrative as it appears in Scripture accessible to an audience of both believers and non-believers. Finally, we have A Hidden Life. The Austrian Franz Jägerstatter the conscientious objector, refuses to fight for the Nazis during World War II. In the realm of literature, this film is partially successful. Its screenplay is based on letters between the protagonist and his wife during his imprisonment by the Nazis. And this, combined with director Terrence Malick's unique directing style, makes for a reflective yet unconventional narrative. In the realm of performance, this film is successful. Its performances are understated, characterized often by glances and silence that communicate volumes, rather than overtly relying on explicative dialogue. In the realm of music, this film is successful. James Newton Howard's score accompanies the visuals with a simple beauty, rather than overtaking them. Finally, in the realm of composition, this film is successful. As you can see, the film's images are grand and intimate in both their content and arrangement. This film is attentive to the following questions. Is undergoing terrible persecution for the sake of the kingdom worth it? Will my sacrifice bring harm rather than good to my loved ones? And can't I just pretend to swear loyalty to this authority that I secretly deplore? These questions have been a part of the Christian life since the time of the apostles, and are even addressed by Christ himself in Matthew's Gospel, who says, "Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what is God's." This film is also conversant in the manner of asking and answering, as it portrays the protagonist experiencing doubt, but ultimately choosing his faith, and going to a fate which seems to the untrained eye a defeat or failure. However, to the faithful, the opposite is true. For as St. Paul writes, "To me, life is Christ, and death is gain." The verdict is that this film is evangelistically effective. The filmmaker's grasp of the art of cinematic storytelling and the model of heroic virtue provided by the film's source material both lend themselves to an edifying film that embraces the words of the psalmist, who writes, "Dear in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his devoted." Given these verdicts, a mimetic depiction of Christianity in film, that is, showing its precepts in action or integrating them naturally, is of far greater evangelistic effectiveness than a diegetic depiction, that is, telling the audience about Christianity and streamlining the faith to the point that those non-believers who are seeking greater truths are prevented from taking those steps toward a deeper faith by such oversimplifications. Consider this analogy. A fisherman casts his line into the sea. His lure is a kind of delicacy to the fish. However, he cannot, does not, and must not force the fish to come. He must wait and let the lure do its thing. In the same way, a filmmaker presents his film to the audience. His lure is the truth, goodness, and beauty present therein. However, he cannot, must not, and does not force the audience to watch. And in the same way, he cannot force the audience to make their own he cannot make conclusions for the audience. Rather, he invites viewers to ponder for themselves. What are audiences to do with all this? The late Bishop Michael Saltarelli offers some recommendations. Quote, "Catholic high schools should consciously develop film criticism skills in students, allowing them to discern the face of Christ in films that are both explicitly and implicitly Christian, and use the discussion of those films as an instrument of evangelization," end quote. Second, he endorses parochial and diocesan efforts to sponsor film festivals and film studies that expose Catholics to the 1995 Vatican list of films and other films that are wholesome, cultural, meaningful, and have eternal significance. Thirdly, he encourages the viewing and discussion of these films within smaller communities and families, while also promoting the presentation of the lives of the saints in films and documentaries with the best scripts and cinematic technique possible. Finally, he encourages the work of all artists, especially those who are Christian, and encourages others to do so, echoing the words of our patron, Pope St. John Paul the Great, who writes, "I appeal to you, artists of the written and the spoken word, of the theater and music, and of the most recent technologies in the field of communication. I appeal to you, especially Christian artists. I wish to remind each of you that beyond functional considerations, the close alliance that has always existed between the gospel and art means that you are invited to use your creative intuition to enter into the heart of the mystery of the incarnate God, and at the same time, into the mystery of man. The creation awaits the revelation of the children of God also in art and through art. This is your task. Humanity in every age, and even today, looks to works of art to shed light upon its path and destiny. Thank you.
We'll begin with faculty questions, please.
Mr. Hanson.
Thank you, Cameron. I'm curious if your twofold analysis could be applied to maybe like a short form television series, something like the show The Chosen or something like that, whether or not it would hold up to a slightly different genre.
Thank you for your question.
Or format.
Thank you for your question. I don't see why the twofold analysis, that specific framework, I don't see why it wouldn't apply to television as well as film, especially those that are faith-based. So I think that, yes, to answer your question, it could be applied. And I think that shows like The Chosen or other long-form faith-based media could hold up to it.
And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the show in particular. For something that is obviously explicitly Christian in its attempts to depict the life of Christ.
Could you rephrase your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you have thoughts about whether it meets the mark or whether it falls short, or if you're familiar with the show.
Yes, I am familiar with the show. I would say that given the framework that I have, both the cinematic analysis and the evangelistic analysis, I would say in terms of cinematic technique, the show does hold up. It's, in terms of sheer production value, it's among the best being produced right now. And as far as evangelistic analysis goes, I would say that for the most part, the show is attentive to the questions, but also conversant in the ways those questions are being asked and answered. So not answering them like abstractly, but applying them to concrete situations.
Thank you.
Ms. Lees.
Thank you, Cameron. In your analysis of the hidden life, in part of your description, you described the end of the film, or maybe prima facie, it seems like the protagonist has failed, but the faithful watcher will know that he has actually been successful in his calling. That reminds me of what Chesterton emphasizes in his book Orthodoxy about the Christian life, and that paradox is at the center of Christianity. And that to me seems like a paradox. Prima facie, it seems like a failure, but it is actually a success. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the role of paradox in portraying an effective Christian film.
Thank you for your question. Could you perhaps be a bit more specific?
Maybe, do you think that paradoxes are essential in producing a mimetic form of Christian film?
Yeah, I think so. Especially when it comes to the juxtaposition of images and meaning. So, for instance, you could have take the Passion of the Christ, for example. Most of the film, it depicts Christ being brutally tortured and eventually killed. And to a non-believer, that is just, well, this is just a snuff film, or this is just gratuitous violence for its own sake. However, believers understand that the violence is necessary to convey the enormity of Christ's sacrifice in his passion. So, yes, I would say that paradox is intrinsic to a good mimetic depiction of Christianity in film.
Thank you.
Mr. Cortez.
Thanks, Cameron. You mentioned the Vatican's list of films, and so I wonder if you have any suggestions for anyone in the audience who are interested in film and perhaps want to dive into this list. How would you suggest we start?
Sure. Thank you for your question. Pull out my copy of the list right here. So I'll just give my personal recommendation for a good film to start with. Perhaps one from each category, as the list is divided into religion, values, and art. So from religion, I would say a good place to start is with The Mission. That's a very, very beautiful film. Let's see. From values, It's a Wonderful Life. And from art, I think most of you have seen The Wizard of Oz, so I won't recommend that one. You know what? I'm gonna go with that one anyway. The Wizard of Oz. Mr. Fang.
Thanks, Cameron. Was thinking about the mimetic form, and I think that could be used to depict a film that maybe doesn't have ultimately a Christian message, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it acceptable for a Christian to watch a mimetic film that does not, and maybe even a message that's antithetical to the Christian message? I'm thinking specifically of, I think it was in your presentation, Silence, which I haven't watched, but I've read.
Sure. Yeah, so just because, thank you for your question. So just because a film, either in its narrative or in its themes, doesn't exactly run parallel with the teachings of the church, or even runs opposite in the case of certain films, that doesn't mean that we can't view those films and contemplate and use the characters' actions as an example of what not to do rather than what we ought to do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool. Ms. Littell.
Thank you, Cameron, for your presentation. I was wondering your thoughts regarding the evangelical-based films. You mentioned them being oversimplified and, I guess, preaching to the choir. But these films that are created within this Christian film industry are very popular, right? It's a very lucrative film industry. Would you suggest it would be better for one not to see these films within their sort of own spiritual journey?
Thank you for your question. I wouldn't say that I would recommend not watching them at all, because despite their tendency to go towards a diegetic depiction rather than a mimetic depiction, that doesn't mean that we can't find little kernels of truth in there. So I would say that if any of you wish to watch those Christian industry films, I would say go for it. But just know that there are also better films that you can work your way towards. So like those could be good starting points.
Thank you.
Do we have any senior questions?
Angelica.
So, for a good, like, evangelical film, do you think it's important for the actors and actresses themselves to be Christian?
Thank you for your question. When it comes to these films, these productions, most often we see that some of the actors are Christian, others aren't. So The Chosen is a good example. Jonathan Rumi, who plays Jesus, is a Catholic, and there are people of various faiths also working on the show. But I think what is essential is a kind of respect for the source material, even if you don't believe it to be inspired scripture, if you're adapting scripture. Having a respect for the source material, but also the faith that the work itself is affirming. Amelie.
So for someone who's maybe like a recent convert to Christianity and who's looking for movies and stuff that do teach them practical things about the faith, do you think that a mimetic movie is still more beneficial to them than the other kind?
Thank you for your question. I would say so, given that these converts are usually, they're on fire, not only spiritually but also intellectually, so they're like a sponge, they're constantly wanting to absorb new information about the faith. And these diegetic films that tend to oversimplify things might prove dissatisfactory when it comes to pursuing greater truths.